One of the things that I've realized in this modern community is we're going to have to get more involved in electronic media. And in fact, I'm just about 10 years too old to really be good at this stuff. I think if you're under 40, people get this. Under 35 maybe, people get this pretty good. If you're over 40, most of us still remember, checking out the floppy disk to make the computer work when you were in college. And young people are saying, "What's a floppy disk?" So it makes it different. Now, pulling out Facebook, this is not something we're going to do every day. I just thought it'd be a nice, fun little exercise this morning. And maybe I want to encourage you to actually do that on a weekly basis. But you can do it early, like when you first come, checking in. If you think about Facebook this morning, let me ask about how many friends you have. All right? So who has more than 1,000 friends? All right, nobody in here is really cool. All right. You're all boring like me. Who has more than 500 friends? More than 500? We got 1, 2. All right, 2 really popular people here. All right. And a few of you are looking at your phone right now trying to figure out how many friends you have. And if you're over 40, you can't figure out where it tells you how many friends you have. So I don't know. I think I have like 200 or 300. I really have no idea. How many of you have like more than 100? All right. Only a few. So most of us really have, a circle that are, smaller, like people we know and stuff like that. So here's the question that I have for you. Do you really know all the friends that you have? Especially the 2 of you who have like over 500. Do you know all those people? That's the interesting part, is that we don't. In fact, I have a study here from Forbes magazine on Facebook friends. This is pretty telling. Dunbar did this study of 3,375 Facebook users between the age of 18 and 65. These users had an average of about 150 friends. So that fits most of us in here. Not crazy friends like the 2, but a normal group of friends that we actually know today, and combined with probably a bunch of people that we haven't seen since high school. But that 50 to 150 range. So out of 150 of average friends, they determined when they took this survey, 4.1 of 150 were dependable, and 13.6 are people who would express sympathy during an emotional crisis. Isn't that interesting? That we live in a world where we have a whole lot of friends on this social media thing. And in fact, many people, especially our younger people in school, who didn't raise their hands probably because they don't want to admit it, but they're trying to get as many friends as they can so that they can say, I have X number of friends on Facebook. The reality is, most of us don't even know who these people are. And the reality is, they're not friends. And we really don't know them. I do connect with people that I know are not my friends, but they're people I knew a long time ago, so it's just kind of fun to have some kind of connection. The study does kind of wrap up to say social media is a good thing, and in fact, it is that timeline, that Facebook communication that allows you to keep up with those 19 people who you actually care what's going on in their life. And if the social media didn't exist, you would probably be limited to just the 4. But that social media lets you keep up with the other 19, all the while ignoring the 480. All right? So interesting stuff this morning about Facebook and the reality of the world that we live in. And I bring that up because over the next 7 weeks, we're going to be starting a study or a series called I Am. And the purpose of this series, or what we're really talking about when we say I Am, it probably brings at least one thing to your mind. If you've been in church very long, you may remember that God said, and we'd even talked about this last week, God said to Moses that I am. He said, tell him that I am sent you. I am who I am. And so maybe that sounds a little bit familiar since we've talked about it quite recently, but we're going to go a little bit further in that. And when we think about who Jesus is, we talk a lot about whether Jesus really existed. We talk about, does Jesus live in your heart? But one of the things I want to discuss over the next 7 weeks is, who does Jesus say that he is? What are his words? And so in the book of John, there are 7 I am statements. There are 7 places in the book of John where Jesus describes himself by saying, I am. So today I want to give you an intro to that study. So it's 7 weeks after today, because we're going to be again talking about the first I am statement next week. All right, so first of all, let's take a look at the intro to the book of John. Raise your hand if you don't have a Bible this morning, and we'll bring one to you. All right, anybody? One? We're here in the front. The book of John. So you probably already know that there's 4 Gospels. There's 4 accounts of the life of Jesus. We call them the Gospels, or the good news. There are 4 Gospel accounts: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All right, so John is one of those 4. When we get these 7 I am statements, they come out of one of those 4 accounts or biographies of Jesus' life on earth. The Apostle John, you hear of Peter and John, Peter, John, James, and Andrew, kind of the 4 inner circle with Jesus. It's that John who wrote the book of John. Now, one other interesting thing that you may or may not know is that out of the 4 gospel accounts, we often think that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all disciples. They were not. Only 2 of those writers of the gospel accounts were actually disciples of the 12 disciples of Jesus. The other 2, so Matthew and John, were 2 of the disciples of Jesus who wrote gospel accounts. Mark and Luke were not part of the 12 disciples. In fact, Mark himself was a disciple of Peter. So when you read the book of Mark, you distinctively get a flavor of Peter's view of the life and ministry of Jesus, because he learned what he learned from Peter. And then when we look at the book of Luke, Luke was a doctor, he was a writer, and so he did a lot of research, and he even says in his account that he did a lot of research and has come back to give us an account of the life of Jesus based on many eyewitness testimonies. And also, just to add to this, when we first see the book of Luke, it's actually attached to the book of Acts. Luke and Acts are really 2 books that go together, and Dr. Luke wrote them both. But John, whom we're reading from today, he is one of the 2 apostles who wrote a gospel account. John is also a book that's a little bit different from the other 3. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are considered synoptic gospels. They are parallel in about 70% to 70 to 80% of what they talk about. If you line them up against each other, they talk about most. They all 3 agree on many of the accounts. John is a little bit different. John oftentimes omits things that were talked about in some of the other books. It's not different. John just does 2 things. One is he focuses on a few different accounts that the other 3 didn't focus on. And number 2, John gives us a little bit more of a spiritual, not just a historical view of who Jesus is. And if you remember, John wrote the book of Revelation. And so he had a spiritual encounter with Jesus, a spiritual encounter with a picture of heaven and earth in the end times. So he was face to face with God's spiritual beings. And so I believe when John came back to write the accounts in John and Revelation, he gives us a perspective that is a little bit more spiritually focused, a little less historically focused. All right? A couple of other things. John refers to himself in the book of John as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Little vanity going on there maybe. When he writes about himself, he says, Peter and the disciple who Jesus loved. Just thought that was some nice trivia for you. And if you want a little bit more humility coming from John, he also points out that he outran Peter to the tomb. I don't know if you remember that, but when he talks about the time where John and Peter were going to the tomb to see, because they heard that it might be empty, they ran as fast as they could. And he says that he was the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, the other disciple outran Peter and got to the tomb first. So, just some interesting trivia for you about John's writing style and how he portrays himself. So, listen, recently as I've been thinking about doing this series, I've been thinking about doing this series for quite some time. I felt like it was a very important series for us to talk about who Jesus really said that he was. All right? So, I've been reading a book by a man named Greg Mott. Greg, I went to Texas A&M University, by the way, which is a very large university in Texas. And Greg Mott started a Bible study in his apartment that grew to about 2,000 to 3,000 every week at the basketball stadium on the main campus at Texas A&M. He is now pastor of a large church in Houston, and he wrote a book called I Am Changes Who I Am. This is actually the church, by the way, he's a pastor of now. This wasn't true at the time, where I was ordained into the Christian ministry in Houston. And so, but anyway, he's a fantastic speaker, a man of God, and wrote this book that has challenged me in a number of ways. And the concept really of this book is not just the 7 I am statements. He talks that there are 7 miracles combined with 7 I am statements in this book. And when we put those together, we begin to realize how the action works with the testimony. So the first point that we're going to talk about, and I don't have monitors, my stage monitor's not on, so I don't know if you know how to turn that on, but if you don't, that's fine. The first point is extraordinary action begs for identity. Extraordinary action begs for identity. You've heard it said probably that actions speak louder than words, right? Actions speak louder than words. So you may say to your boyfriend or girlfriend or your spouse or whatever, or maybe your mom, when she's giving you a good memory course with the belt, and she says, I really love you. This hurts you more than it hurts me. And you're saying, okay, actions speak louder than words. You're wearing me out. I'm not sure if I believe the I love you part, okay? All right? And so if you're in a dating relationship and somebody, is not treating you well, but they tell you that they love you, sometimes you sit back as the person who's not being treated well, and you say to yourself, or maybe out loud, well, I believe it when I see it, when I see it in action. So it's true. We think of that today. And when we think of the Gospels, we often do think about action, right? I mean, when you think of the Gospel stories in the first 4 books of the New Testament, what do we think of? Jesus, how was he born? A virgin, right? Born of Virgin Mary, rose from the dead, performed many miracles, spoke to thousands. We're thinking about actions, aren't we? And that's what we think of when we think of the Gospels. And Jesus knew that. So Jesus performed many actions. Jesus healed a blind man. He forgave sin. He touched and healed a leper. Now, if a leper were to walk in here right now, how many of you would touch him or her? Knowing that it's pretty contagious. All right? Most of us wouldn't do that. Jesus touched and healed a leper. He told a cripple to get up and walk. He told them that he forgave their sin, which was blasphemy in the time that Jesus lived. And of course, the big one, not just his own death and rising from the grave, but he raised Lazarus from the grave, right? You might not remember, but Lazarus was not the only one he raised. But that Lazarus is the one that we remember. Remember, he came out of the tomb, they rolled the stone away and said, Lazarus, come forth. And if you read it in the King James, it says he stinketh. Right? So Jesus was a man that had a lot of action in his life. And those of us today who study him think mostly of those actions. But here's the cool thing. Jesus also spoke to thousands on the side of the hill. He spoke to so many on the shore in the Sea of Galilee that he had to get out in a boat and push away just a little bit so he didn't get pushed into the water himself. He fed 5,000, and another time he fed 4,000. There were many people who were following Jesus. Why do you think they followed him? They didn't just randomly show up, right? They had heard of the actions. They had heard of the healings. They had heard of the feedings. They had heard of this great rabbi who's out doing these wonderful things. They had heard how he loved the sinners, the tax collectors, the prostitutes. They heard. And they had to come and see. You remember a young tax collector named Zacchaeus. He was kind of the head tax collector of the area over all of the other tax collectors. He heard of the action of how Jesus took in other tax collectors and had a party at their house, just him and the tax collectors. And probably their boss said, I got to figure out who this Jesus is, because the stuff he's doing is shocking to me. So actions speak louder than words, and sometimes the words don't matter much until we see the action, right? Do you remember John the Baptist? John the Baptist over in Matthew 11, 2 through 6. Levi, if you can put that up there. Matthew 11, 2 through 6. John was in prison. Yeah, there we go. John, who was in prison, heard about the deeds of the Messiah. He sent his disciples to ask him, are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else? Jesus replied, go back and report to John what you hear. He's telling his disciples. His disciples came to Jesus. John is in jail from Herod, and he hadn't gotten out of jail. And the Messiah, the one that John was coming as a forerunner to, the one that John was telling everyone about and prophesying about, Jesus is doing all these powerful things, and John's sitting in jail. He doesn't quite understand why. But because of the things he's hearing, he sends his disciples to talk to Jesus. And in verse 4, Jesus said, go back and report to John what you hear and what you see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. He says, look at the action. You see, John the Baptist knew who Jesus was supposed to be. Jesus pointed to the actions to confirm, I am who you're looking for. I am the Messiah. I am the one. And then Jesus follows that up by saying, blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. Now that's, why would Jesus say you're going to stumble on the account of me? Why would we stumble on the account of Jesus? Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is the creator of all of us. He's the creator of our being. He's the creator of the earth. He's the creator of all things. The Bible says that Jesus was actually the one that did the creative work in the beginning. Why would we stumble on the account of him? It might be because we were expecting something out of Jesus because of the power we believed he had. And when he did not display that power in our lives the way we expect, some will give up and turn away. Jesus is saying, you believed I was the Messiah. You pointed people to me to say I was the Messiah. Look at all the things that I'm doing. It's me. But be careful not to fall away because of what you're expecting from me. Okay? So John had heard about all that Jesus was doing, but it didn't make sense with what he was experiencing because he was stuck in prison. He needed to know from Jesus that he was who he was. Some of you may be wondering today something very similar to what John was wondering. You may be wondering, how can God really be the God that I hear he is, that I have believed that he was, and that I have pointed people to? How could he really be the one who does miracles that I read about in the New Testament? How could he be the one whose spirit fills my soul when I become a follower of Christ, indwells in me, and speaks to God on my behalf in my prayer through groans that I can't even understand? How can that God be real in my life when I'm suffering and not experiencing his deliverance from whatever I'm facing today? Some of us are there. All Jesus could say at that time was, look at all that I have done. I am the one. Don't be discouraged. Don't give up believing in me because your experience doesn't make sense. Look at what you know and trust that it is me. The same principle applies today, does it not? When we want people to visit our church or to believe in the Jesus that we talk about, or to believe that we are a positive influence in our community, how will they believe that unless they see it? So when we put on our Live Differently red shirts and walk down the street picking up trash, people always stop and say something. They write Facebook posts. Some of them will stop and bring us a case of water. Some of them have multiple times people have stopped by and gave us food, like a guy who delivers, muffins and, food like that. Stopped, picked up a case of something, got out of the back of his truck. Here, bless you guys for what you're doing. People stop all the time. You know why? Because the action validates our communication. When our action is extraordinary, people want to know who we are. The extraordinary action begs for identity. If you remember, can anybody quote our vision statement? We want to be a church where people can see, hear, and experience life. Long before I ever conceived of this message series, one thing that I have learned in church ministry over the years is that if we want people to experience life, they have to understand the gospel. They have to hear the gospel of Christ so that they can understand what it means to place their faith in Jesus. But it's all in order, because if we want them to hear that message, they have got to see something in our lives that leads them to listen. When we talk about our vision statement being to see, hear, and experience life, it's in order. Order is important in our vision statement. People must first see the life of Christ lived out in our community of faith. If they see something that makes sense with their picture of a loving God, then they will listen to the message that community and its leaders are communicating. And I believe when they hear the message of the gospel of Jesus and it lines up with what they're seeing in the actions in our church's life, then many will begin to experience the full life that Jesus promises. That's our vision statement. Because extraordinary action begs for identity. Next, Jesus' identity brings freedom. Jesus' identity brings freedom. Jesus did all these actions for a reason. He didn't just do it because he wanted us to follow a great miracle worker. Jesus did it to validate who he was. And so now, to make no mistake about who he was, he tells us. And since he performed 5 miracles, 5 of those 7 miracles, since he performed 5 miracles before he spoke his first I am statement, we can believe, or we can set and listen closely for who he says now that he is. So let me briefly introduce what we're going to go into over the next 7 weeks. First of all, Jesus, the first I am statement. Jesus said unto them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger. He who believes in me shall never thirst. Number 2, Jesus spoke to them again, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Number 3, I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved. and will go in and out and find pasture. We talked about that one last week. Number 4, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for his sheep. Number 5, and Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. Number 6, Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And number 7, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Inherent in these 7 I am statements is not just that he is declaring who he is and giving you a description of who he is. He is also identifying himself as the great I am in the book of Exodus. Look at Exodus 3:11, and if you're in the life group, bless you. If you're not, shame on you. No, I'm kidding. This is something we talked about in a life group last week. If you're not in a life group, I just want to say I encourage you to come. But we talked about this a little bit last week in our study through the Multiply series in our life group in Exodus 3. If we can put that up there. Yeah, Exodus 3. Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And if you remember right, Moses had been a shepherd for 40 years, so he's kind of disconnected from the whole Egyptian thing. But the one connection he still has from the whole Egyptian thing is that he is a fugitive who killed one of the Egyptian guards who was mistreating his nation of slaves. So while Moses kind of grew up in Pharaoh's palace, he was still of the nation of the slaves who were building the cities of Egypt, who they don't ever want to leave because they're their free labor. But he killed one of their bosses. So you got to think his first thoughts are, I ain't going back there. They're going to kill me. And so he says his first question to God, when God said, I'm sending you back to tell Pharaoh to let my people go, he says, who am I to do that? It makes no sense. And God said in verse 12, God said, I will be with you. So we ask ourselves the question. He asked 2 questions. His first question was, God, who am I? And God said, I will tell you who you are. You are the one whom I am with. And you don't need to know anything else about yourself except to know that I am with you. And then Moses asked another question. Suppose I go to the Israelites and I say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what is his name? This is what you are to say to them. I am has sent you to me. And this is where we learn something about God. It is a name or a description of eternality. He didn't say I was or I'm going to be. He said I am. I am in the past, I am in the present, I am in the future. That represents 2 things. Number 1, it represents that there was no beginning and there is no end. I am eternal. And the second thing it represents is power. I am what? What does he say that he is? He just says I am because he is everything. That's who God is. And so that actually gave strength to who Moses was. Because the answer to who Moses is that Moses, I am with you and I am. And Jesus, inherent in these 7 I am statements, is saying, I am, I am, I am, I am. And while that may seem normal just to say, I am a school teacher, I am a mail carrier, I am a computer programmer, all these things. This was more significant in the time of Jesus because these were words that left a powerful mark on the identity of one in the religion of Judaism who was claiming a connection with God. And if you weren't completely sure, let's get more clear. In John 8:52 through 59, here's the story of the Jews when they asked Jesus, and they said something. They were comparing him to Moses and saying, you think you're this big shot, but Moses did all these things. And they said to Jesus, you're not yet 50 years old. Have you even seen Abraham? And Jesus answered them in a way that they could not miss. He said, very truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am. If it weren't more clear, he leaves it right there. He says, I am ego eimi, exactly as God said it in the book of Exodus. And what was the reaction? The Jews' reaction was to try to stone Jesus because he claimed to be equal to God. The Jewish leaders knew what it was that he was saying. Jesus is the eternal God who is everything. He is the one whom John the Baptist was looking for. Jesus does promise to be with us. In the next 7 weeks, we're going to look more specifically at each of the I am statements of Jesus so that we will better understand who he is. Today, you may be like Moses, saying, God, who am I? Who am I to do any of the things that you say you want me to do? Who am I to go speak to my neighbor? Who am I to show up next week at See You at the Pole to pray for our schools? Who am I? Who am I to step up and serve in a ministry of the church? Look at all the messes I've made. I've done some really bad stuff. How can I serve? How can I be a witness to those around me to faith? Moses said, who am I? I killed an Egyptian. I can't go back there and save my people because of the mess I made. Some of you may be like John the Baptist, saying, who are you? Are you really who you say you are? Let me ask you to every head bowed and every eye closed. And let me just say very simply this morning that Jesus wants you to know him. He wants you to know who he is.